Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, we can get started. When Nick does sign in, he'll be able to see it.
Yeah.
I also sent him my slides and everything I was going to say.
So I'm just going to start very quickly.
Actually, cool. Should I sit down?
So we're still waiting for Nick to get on Zoom, but we will start because we only have 75 minutes. I will keep this introduction really short. So what the person you're gonna hear now is someone who is a very talented and experienced field worker and a phonologist. And that's a very rare thing, and that did not go unnoticed by the Boston University Department of Linguistics Search Committee, who snapped her up, and she will be starting there this fall as an assistant professor of linguistics. And today we are going to hear about ghost elements in Ende.
Great, thank you. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you all for coming. And thank you, Arta, for the introduction. I'm going to try and do some of my gesturing through the slides on the computer, just so anyone who's Skyping in can also see my gestures. So that's why I'm orienting myself this way, but I do see you all. And yeah, so thank you all for coming to my dissertation defense. I'm very proud of my dissertation work. It involved a lot of hard work, and it involved a lot of time that I spent away from home, and it involved a lot of time where I spent it learning a language called Ende, and this language, Ende, had not been considered until now. It hadn't been considered in our, as we write descriptions of theoretical phonology. This language hadn't been considered until now. So it took a lot of work to understand this language and to take the lessons that I learned and apply it to the field of phonology. So my dissertation presents this language, Ende, as a gift to the field of linguistics as we continue to figure out what language is and what language does. And I present it as a gift because the language was presented as a gift to me from the speakers, the Ende speakers of Limol, who taught me about this language. This gift comes with a reciprocal responsibility, as all gifts do, or most gifts do in Papua New Guinea, where as we benefit from this shared knowledge that the Ende people shared with us, it's now our responsibility to remember the people behind the words, behind the language that we're talking about, and to also share our knowledge and our gifts back with them as well. Speaking of remembering and honoring, I would also like to take a moment to remember and honor the Muwekma Ohlone people whose unceded land we are on right now, and who continue to live and protect their language and culture in this area and in this place. So today I'm going to be focusing on just one of the biggest claims that I make in my dissertation. And that claim that I make is one of the ones that informs kind of global linguistic ideas. So it shows just how much of an impact that the complex phonological patterns that we learned about in Ende, just how much of an impact that new data has on the field of phonology and the field of linguistics. It also teaches us about what types of languages we can predict to encounter in the world today. So the claim that I will defend today is the following. The phonological grammar, and by phonological grammar, what I mean is the theoretical framework that we use to explain phonological patterns in the world's languages. This grammar is sensitive to subsegmental components such as the skeleton and the melody. This claim is supported by new analyses of ghost elements, ghost element patterns, which require a representational distinction between subsegmental types. So in my presentation today, I'm going to walk you through this claim. And first, what I'll do is I'll explain all of the words on this slide. I'll tell you what I mean by ghosts, melodies, skeletons, and subsegments. And I'm going to bring in data from languages around the world to illustrate these patterns. So first, let me tell you what I mean by ghost. I have adopted the term ghost element as an umbrella term for all of the terms that ghost elements have been called over the last 3 decades. This includes latent segments, floating features, ghost consonants, phantom vowels, and a few others. Something like a ghost element has been described in languages like Finnish, French, Turkish, and many other languages. Essentially, what a ghost element is it's a sound in a word or a structure in a word that appears or disappears kind of erratically or idiosyncratically. It's not like the other sounds in the language. So it's somewhat unpredictable in this sense. And this appearing and disappearing nature is what has led many people to call it a ghost or a phantom or something like this. One ghost pattern that you may know of are the Slavic year vowels. So many Slavic languages have roots that feature disappearing vowels. So for example, in Polish, I'm going to use this. The nominative singular forms of the word sweater and setter, that are sweater and setter, they both contain 2 front mid vowels in the root here. So you can see how they both contain those. In the genitive form, however, sweater becomes setra, and setter becomes setera. So the second front vowel disappears in the genitive for sweater, but it doesn't disappear for setter. And so the question is what's the difference between these 2 vowels? Why does one disappear and one not? A traditional analysis for this type of element has been to posit an underlying representation for the vowel in setter that is stronger than the underlying representation for the vowel in setter. Okay, so you can see how these 2 segments share the same melody, so they're pronounced the same, but the one in setter has this skeletal, timing slot that hosts the melody that gives it a little bit extra umph. It's a little bit harder to delete. This idea of a subsegment comes from the framework of autosegmental phonology. Autosegmental phonology put forth the idea that sequences of sounds in a language are not composed of a single linear sequence of sound, but rather tiers of sequences of sounds. The 2 tiers that we're going to be talking about today are this idea of a melodic tier and an idea of a skeletal tier. The melody is, we can kind of think of the melody as a bundle of all the features that when we hear a sound, what the features that give it the qualities that we hear when it comes out of our mouths. The skeleton is a more structural component that represents the linearization or the timing slots in that word. And so we can kind of use this metaphor of music. We can think of the melody as the notation of music of like an A note, which signifies the frequency of that note or of that sound, whereas the skeleton are like the note stems and flags that tell us how long a segment's going to take and kind of fixes it within a word. This concept of a subsegmental element in the underlying form as opposed to a full segmental element, so this difference between, for example, the 2 E's in Polish, this was one of the major contributions of Cheryl Zoll's 1996 dissertation on ghost elements. One of the most important claims that she made was that all ghost elements could be represented uniformly in the underlying form. She said all ghost elements are subsegments. Before her analysis, it was thought that there must be multiple representational types of ghost elements because of a very interesting property of ghost elements, and that property is that some ghost elements will float through words. They don't have a fixed position in a word, and some other ghost elements are latent, or like they stay in one place. And so the idea before this was that if you had a floating ghost element and a latent ghost element, that those were somehow distinct in their underlying representation. But what Cheryl showed was that this behavior of floating or latency could actually be determined by an interaction of grammatical constraints in the phonological grammar. Let me just give you an example of what a floating ghost element and a latent ghost element look like. We can look at Chaha, which is an Afroasiatic language spoken in central Ethiopia. So this first example is an example of a floating ghost. The marker for object agreement in Chaha is this suffix here, wa. It's realized as a labial feature on the rightmost labial or dorsal consonant in the word. So if we take the first verb, danug, the rightmost consonant here is a G, this G. It's dorsal, and therefore the labial feature can dock onto this rightmost consonant. In the next verb, makar, the rightmost consonant is R. It's not dorsal or labial, but the penultimate consonant, this K, is. So the floating feature here floats leftward and is realized on the K instead of on the rightmost element. In the third verb, katar, the only labializable segment in the word, the only segment that can host this floating feature is the initial segment here. And so the floating feature is word initial. Finally, in the fourth word, sadad, none of the segments in this word can host the labial feature, and so the labial feature just deletes. It disappears. We don't see it at all. We can contrast this floating ghost with a latent ghost. So also in Chaha, the imperative, so when you're giving an order to somebody, it's marked by a palatal feature. And this palatal feature is also aligned to the right edge of the word. The palatal feature can only be realized on a coronal or a velar consonant. So for the example of nakas here and watak, the rightmost consonants are either coronal or velar, and so the palatal feature can be realized on these final consonants just fine. But in this third verb, katar, the rightmost consonant is not palatalizable. And even though the penultimate consonant, the T, even though that consonant could host the palatal feature doesn't float leftward. It just disappears. So for this latent segment, for the palatal feature, it's more important for it to be aligned to the right than to appear in the word at all. Whereas for the floating feature, it was more important for the feature to be realized, even if it wasn't going to be aligned exactly on the right edge of the word. What Cheryl Zoles showed in her dissertation was that floating ghosts and latent ghosts are actually the same underlyingly. We could call them both subsegments of a sort. And she accounts for their distinctive behavior through an interaction of phonological constraints that determine faithfulness and unmarkedness in phonological outputs. To get a floating behavior of an element, you have to rank a certain constraint above another. And so for a floating behavior, you have this constraint max subseg. That constraint says don't delete a subsegment, don't delete a ghost element. If that's ranked above an alignment constraint that says the ghost element has to be aligned to the right of the word, then it's going to violate alignment in order to satisfy the constraint that says don't delete. So that's how you get this floating process. For a latent segment, if you have the alignment constraint, this ghost element must be aligned to the right edge of the word. If that's ranked above max subseg, which is don't delete it, then it's going to be more important for the alignment constraint to be satisfied than it is for the realization constraint to be satisfied. Both the labial and the palatal features in Chaha are compositionally like the Slavic year vowels that I showed you earlier. A traditional analysis for these is that they are composed of a melody, but that they lack the timing slot or the skeletal tier that is a subcomponent of every other segment in the word. So because they lack this feature, that means that it's easier to delete them. They may have these floating properties. They behave differently than other full segments in the word. Because this type of subsegment is composed of a melody but lacks the skeletal tier, we can call this type of ghost a melodic ghost because it contains the melody. A logical extension of this subsegmental typology is to consider a ghost element that is specified for its skeletal structure but unspecified for its melody. We can call this type of ghost element a skeletal ghost because it has a skeleton but no melody. An example of this type of ghost, of a skeletal ghost, are Finnish ghost consonants. So very briefly, Finnish exhibits a pattern of ghost structure in which some nouns inflect as if they end in a consonant or behave as if they end in a consonant, even though that consonant is not normally pronounced. So if we compare the two nouns in Finnish, or these two words in Finnish, piene and like, Normally what happens when you have a mid-front vowel at the end of a word, you see raising of that vowel to E. So for small, we have PNA being pronounced on the surface as PNE. In contrast, we have this word like like, where you don't see final raising of that vowel. It's as if this word ends with a consonant but not in a vowel. So that consonant is blocking the vowel raising. We also see evidence of this ghost consonant in when these words are affixed with the partitive suffix. So this partitive suffix here, normally when it attaches to a word that ends in a vowel, that vowel is deleted. But when we see it being attached to this word here, like, that ends in this ghost consonant, the final vowel isn't deleted. And in fact, the first consonant in the partitive suffix geminates as if it's filling that extra consonant slot that was in the underlying form. So you see two consonants there instead of one, or a geminated consonant instead of one. So based on the typology of floating and latent ghosts, what Zoll finds is that this binary distinction between segment and subsegment is sufficient for the analysis of these ghost patterns. Today, what I'm going to show you is that this binary distinction between segment and subsegment is not enough to account for all the ghost element patterns of languages in the world. What we need is a further distinction, a representational distinction between a melodic ghost and a skeletal ghost. This right here is like the big change that I'm proposing today. I will show you that not only does this new distinction between melodic ghosts and skeletal ghosts account for the data that's in Ende, but it also continues to account for the ghost element patterns that we see in Chaha and Finnish and Polish as well. So to return to the definitional properties of ghost elements, I'm going to show you a new behavior. So we know that ghosts can either float or stay in one place, but there's another behavior of ghost elements, and it's this behavior that requires us to make this secondary distinction between melodic and skeletal ghosts. And what this behavior is that ghosts appear and they disappear. Some ghosts are like to be present. They are by default present within the word. And some ghosts are by default absent, and they only come in if they're needed. So the reason that ghosts appear and disappear is usually to solve a problem within the word. So we can think of a phonological markedness problem, like having two consonants that are too close together. One way that we could solve this problem of having these two consonants right next to each other is for an element to appear, like a vowel to come in between those two consonants. So that would be an example of an appearing ghost. Another way to resolve this problem of two consonants being right next to each other is for one of the consonants to disappear. So that would be an example of a disappearing ghost. The first type of ghost I like to call a martyr ghost. Martyr ghosts are present in the input by default, but in case of a problem, they are the first ones to delete. They sacrifice themselves for the sake of the word. The opposite type of ghost is called a hero ghost. A hero ghost is a ghost element that is absent by default, but swoops in to save the day in case of a problem. So if there's no problem, you don't need the hero ghost around. Let me give you an example of these two types. So Chaha object labialization is an example of a martyr ghost. When the labial feature is realized within the word, like in these first three examples, it's not doing so to solve a problem. It's there because it's realized by default. It just wants to be there. If it weren't realized, you wouldn't have a problem with the word. It's only in cases where the labial feature is not realized where we see a possible markedness situation. In this final verb, sudud, if one of the segments were hosting this labial feature, this would be a violation of some kind of markedness constraint that says that coronal consonants can't host labial sounds. To avoid this violation, the labial feature sacrifices itself and disappears. So this is a martyr ghost pattern. The Polish year vowels are an example of a hero ghost. When the year vowel is realized within the word, it's necessary because otherwise you would have clusters of consonants like ps and sweter, and these are not permissible in Polish. In contexts where the year vowel is not needed to solve a problem, it's not realized. So this is the behavioral properties of a hero ghost. Martyr and hero ghost behavior can be regulated by faithfulness constraints in the grammar. Essentially, a martyr ghost is a ghost element that would rather be realized than be deleted. So if you have a constraint that says, don't delete this ghost, and that constraint is ranked higher than don't realize this ghost, then you're going to get martyr type behavior. The opposite behavior is the hero. That's a ghost element that would rather be deleted than be realized. So if you have a constraint that says don't realize this ghost ranked above a constraint that says don't delete it, you're going to get the the hero type behavior. But notice how these two constraints, so max subseg, don't delete the ghost, ranked above depth subseg, don't realize it or don't insert it. Notice how the two, the rankings that we need to produce martyr behavior and to produce hero behavior involve the same constraints. If we had both martyr ghosts and hero ghosts in the same language, we wouldn't know how to rank these two constraints with respect to one another. You would get a ranking paradox. So I'm going to show you today a language that does indeed have both martyr ghosts and hero ghosts. That's Ende. And I'm going to propose a solution, essentially by distinguishing the type of ghost in the underlying form. So the data that I'm presenting to you today was shared with me by the Ende-speaking people of southern Papua New Guinea. My journey to today's talk started 4 years ago on a long boat ride that came up along this river and down the Vituri River to this village of Limo, which is right here. This was in the summer of 2015, and the young woman here is Lois Krupel, and she was one of the first Ende speakers that I met. I was invited to Limo to assist the Ende community in their goals of creating a linguistic record of their language, and also of compiling linguistic materials to meet their literacy and educational goals. I spent an amazing 11 months in the village of Limo, and the experience for me was linguistic bliss. I gathered data on 5 different linguistic varieties that are all shaded here. And I came back with heaps of data and research questions that I've only just begun to scratch the surface of. While I was there, I worked with Ende speakers to compile an Ende dictionary, which contains 5,000 words. We also worked together to transcribe a corpus of natural speech, which has 200,000 words. And we also elicited 500 verb paradigms as we explored the very complex verbal phonology of the language. So I'm going to tell you about some of those patterns that we saw and discuss how this new data has implications for our understandings of theoretical phonology. So here's the structure of today's talk. I'm going to show you 2 types of ghost patterns in Ende. The first pattern is floating nasals, which involve nasal segments that float through words. The second pattern is Ende infinitival reduplication. This is a morphological reduplication process that forms words from roots and ensures that monomorphemic words are of a minimal word length. Floating nasals are an example of a martyr ghost, and infinitival reduplication is an example of a hero ghost. The traditional treatment of ghost elements has been to represent these 2 things as identical, or in the underlying representation. And I'm going to show you that when they co-occur within the same word, that we get this ranking paradox, and we have to solve it somehow. I will solve it, and I will discuss some theoretical implications stemming from this work and give you a peek at some future directions. So the first ghost pattern that we'll discuss today is Ende floating nasals. Ende floating nasals are a bit like the Chaha floating labialization feature that I already showed you, in that it involves a melodic martyr ghost. And in this case, this nasal is aligned to the left edge of the word, and it's looking for its optimal position within the word, as long as it can be as leftmost as possible. To illustrate this pattern, I'll be showing you 2 forms of Ende verbs, an inflected form and an infinitival form. The inflected form features inflectional affixes, such as prefixes and suffixes. And so the verb root is always in the middle of the word, because there's always a prefix that precedes it. In contrast, the infinitival form does not have any inflectional prefixes, and so the verb root is always word initial. So that's the big difference for these 2 types. So this first verb here means to dive for fish. I've emphasized the root here, kabag, and the root is preceded by a prefix that marks tense and patient and a suffix that marks the tense and agent. We can compare the inflected form with the infinitival form. So unlike the inflected form, the infinitival form does not have a prefix, and it does not have a suffix. The root is realized in this context as kumbag. So the only difference between the roots in these two contexts is that the nasal sound, this nga that preceded the k in the inflected form, is now a ma that precedes the b in the infinitival form. So we see this alternation. What this alternation does is it showcases the floating nature of the floating nasals. We can take a look at a few more examples. In this first verb, diving for fish, we see that the ma that preceded the b floats forward to precede the k when it's preceded by a prefix. So as long as this k is not word initial, it can host the nasal. This verb, embodig or bodding, shows us how the nasal segment can alternate between two consonants that are not adjacent on the consonantal tier. It skips this sonorant in the middle. So it was preceding the G when the B was word initial, but then it floats leftward to precede the B in the inflected form. Here's a table of 48 verbs that feature this same pattern. If a verb has only one obstruent, and that obstruent is word initial, then the nasal's only going to appear in the form in which that obstruent is not word initial, because we can't have nasal obstruent clusters at the beginning of a word. So it is for the verb semen, which means to be in heaps. In the infinitival form, there's no evidence of the floating nasal anywhere, but in the inflected form, it appears. So this is the disappearing behavior. Here is a table of 33 verbs that have these disappearing nasals. If, however, a verb with only one obstruent has that obstruent in a non-root initial position, then the nasal is actually going to remain in place, and it doesn't actually look like it's alternating, right? So the only obstruent that this nasal segment can precede is this velar G, and even in the inflected form, it's still the leftmost obstruent that it can precede. Here are 15 verb roots that feature these kind of stationary nasals. They come of two types. Sometimes it's because there's one obstruent in the word, like the arong type, where in both cases, the leftmost obstruent is the same one. A more common form is when you have reduplication in the infinitive, and we're going to be talking about the infinitive, reduplication in the infinitive really soon. So I hope that the pattern is quite clear. Basically, the nasals in question always precede the first obstruent in the root when the root is in word medial position. And if the root is in word initial position, then it's going to precede the second obstruent, or whatever, the leftmost obstruent that's not also initial. Otherwise, it disappears. These general patterns can be straightforwardly formalized in an optimality theory framework with using ranked and violable constraints. So we can assume that the input for a verb that contains a floating nasal has a morpheme that is plus nasal. That's what contributes the nasal that floats through the word. The floating nasal we have represented here is this small case n. Okay. So the first constraint that is active for this pattern is the sonority sequencing principle, which assigns a violation for every word that begins with a nasal obstruent sequence. So if the candidate here begins with a nasal followed by an obstruent, like unkabag, this constraint says, okay, that's not a great way to start a word, next. Kumbag is it does not violate the sonority sequencing principle and is thus the more optimal candidate. The second constraint that is active for this pattern is an alignment constraint. The alignment constraint regulates the leftward preference of the nasal. So the further to the right that the nasal is in the word, the more times it's going to violate alignment. So the happy medium for this input is the candidate that doesn't violate the sonority sequencing principle and minimally violates the alignment constraint. So kumbag, where the nasal is as left as it can be, is going to still be the optimal candidate. The next two constraints are depth subseg, which assigns a violation for every inserted subsegment, and integrity, which assigns a violation for copying. And what these two constraints do is they regulate the place feature of this nasal. So we see that in the observed output in kumbag, the nasal feature copies the place of the following obstruent. That's why it is realized as an M before a B, but as a ng before a K, and as an N before a D. So it's copying the place of the following obstruent. When it copies that place, it violates this constraint called integrity, which basically says don't copy things from other segments. Don't take those. If it were going to be an epenthetic segment, so let's say it just always was realized as a coronal N, as the least marked form, that would violate dep subseg, which says don't insert that epenthetic segment. And if dep subseg is ranked above integrity, then copying is the ideal way to realize that feature as opposed to inserting. Okay. The fifth active constraint in this pattern is max subseg, which says don't delete the ghost element. So this candidate here, kabag, where the nasal segment is deleted and doesn't even appear, that candidate violates max subseg because the ghost element is gone. It doesn't violate integrity because it didn't do any copying, and it doesn't violate dep subseg because it didn't do any inserting, but it does violate max subseg because it deleted it. So by ranking max subseg over dep subseg and integrity, we still get the observed candidate as the optimal candidate, which is come back. Finally, we can consider a verb that exhibits the disappearing alternation. So for zamen, the only obstruent available for the nasal to proceed is in word initial position here, in zamen. But that violates the sonority sequencing principle. So we have to compare two candidates, one where the N is deleted, zamen, and one in which the Z is deleted, namen. The candidate with the N deleted violates max subseg, as we talked about before, because the ghost element is deleted. But the candidate with Z, this full segment deleted, violates max segment because a full segment is deleted. Max segment is ranked above max subsegment, which means it's better to delete the ghost element than it is to delete a full segment in the word, right? So we can see the full ranking for floating nasals here. And I didn't walk you through the constraints that were necessary for correspondence between the nasal and the obstruent, or for aligning it that way, but I can explain it in the Q&A if you would like. The crucial ranking that is relevant for today is the fact that max subsegment is ranked above dep subsegment and integrity. And that's what gives the floating nasals their martyr type behavior. It's better for them to be realized than it is for them to be deleted. So recall, yes, that this is the type of behavior that I call a martyr ghost. The opposite type of ghost is a hero ghost. And an example of a hero ghost is Ende infinitival reduplication. So I'll explain that to you now. Ende infinitival reduplication is a pattern that's also observed in infinitival verbs. So remember, infinitival verbs don't have prefixes, and they don't have these tense and agent suffixes either. So if we look at the verb to look for, which is jag, when it's in the inflected form, it's realized as jag, but in the infinitival form, it's realized as jag. It's doubled or reduplicated. However, not all verb roots reduplicate in the infinitive. We already saw a couple verbs that don't, and this one doesn't either. So the verb ngamen, which means to take off running, is ngamen in both its inflected and its infinitival forms. Basically, there are two properties of the infinitival form that have to be met in order for us to see reduplication in the infinitive. First, the infinitival form must be monomorphemic. It can only be made up of one morpheme, and that is the root itself. And second, the form must be monosyllabic. It can only be one syllable long. If if the root has a pluractional suffix, which adds a morpheme, an applicative suffix, which also adds a morpheme, or if it's multisyllabic, has more than one syllable, then we don't see reduplication. So we see that this pattern is sensitive both to morphology as well as to phonology. So I'll give you two analyses, one that explains the sensitivity to morphology, and then one that gives the sensitivity to phonology. So the following analysis explains why infinitival reduplication appears to be sensitive to morphological structure. Essentially, there are three ways to form infinitival verbs in Ende. A root can combine with a pluractional suffix. There are 4 conjugation classes in Ende of verb roots, and I've given them Roman numerals 1 through 4. The pluractional suffix distinguishes between non-plural and plural, either of subjects, objects, or event number. And so that gives us 4 classes, 2 distinctions. It gives us 8 subclasses. 6 of those subclasses have obligatory pluractional suffixes in the infinitive, and those are listed there. A root can also be affixed with an applicative suffix. The applicative agrees with a benefactor or a dative argument or a causae argument with the verb. And so the root can be affixed with the applicative suffix, or it could be affixed with both the pluractional and the applicative. Finally, there's the third way to form an infinitival verb, and that is by prefixing a thematic vowel before it. So these roots of these two subclasses, subclass 1 and subclass 2, take a vowel that precedes it, and it's this vowel that triggers the phonological duplication. Let me explain these each in a little more detail. So the 4 classes of verb roots, so 6 of these classes take obligatory, regular, pluractional suffixes. And here are some examples. So these are examples of classes 2, 3, and 4. And note how all of these forms are monosyllabic, kun, gan, blab, kam, but they do not show any signs of reduplication. And instead, they show pretty regular signs of inflectional morphology afterwards. So you've got this pattern. The second way to form an infinitival form of the verb is with the applicative suffix. And here we see how the applicative suffix is affixed onto a verb that already has a pluractional suffix. And we see that the ordering goes pluractional suffix followed by applicative suffix. Finally, an infinitival verb can be formed by prefixing a thematic vowel to any verb root that does not require a pluractional suffix. So this is conjugation class 1, non-plural, and conjugation class 2, plural. So one objection that you may have is to say, well, why don't you just say that reduplication is a morphological instantiation of the pluractional suffixes? You could just say, well, these 6 subclasses take a pluractional suffix, and these 2 subclasses take a pluractional prefix, and it's just realized as reduplication. That would fold these 2 formulas together and make this a little bit simpler. However, infinitival forms that are formed via pluractional affixation and via reduplication, they behave differently with respect to the applicative. And so that's what's motivated me to have these 3 different formulas. Here is an example of verbs that reduplicate in their infinitive. So we can see that in the inflected form, we have ko, koko. It could be partial reduplication, unko, kunko, dro, do, dro. When the applicative suffix is added, if this were a pluractional prefix, we would expect to see both the pluractional prefix and the applicative suffix, just like we saw with the other verbs where we saw both the pluractional suffix and the applicative suffix. But we don't see that. What we see is the verb root followed by the applicative suffix. The reduplication is blocked in these cases. Okay. So now that we've determined why the morphological structure affects reduplication, we can turn to the phonological sensitivity of the pattern. What we see is that monomorphemic verb roots reduplicate if they're monosyllabic, but not if they're multisyllabic. The verbs in this table are also verbs in conjugation classes 1 and 2, but they don't exhibit reduplication in the infinitive form. The only difference between these verbs that don't reduplicate and the verbs that do reduplicate are the number of syllables that are in the root. So ngamen, itrel, tali, patrol, all of these have more than 1 syllable. Of the 500 verbs in the Ende verb corpus, only 4 monosyllabic verbs do not reduplicate in the infinitival form. Interestingly, these 4 verbs all end with a coronal fricative, which may indicate that they belong to an exceptional morphological class of some sort. Maybe these are not simple roots. So I propose that the underlying form of the multisyllabic verbs and the monosyllabic verbs are the same. They're each preceded by this thematic vowel prefix. This thematic vowel gets deleted instead of being realized if the verb root is already long enough. So this is an example of a hero ghost. If this thematic vowel is being realized in order to save a monosyllabic form from being too short, it must be disyllabic. It doesn't have to realize if the form is already disyllabic because there's no problem there. It's not too short. So this pattern can be modeled in optimality theory using just 5 constraints. So notice how the input for this form is a thematic vowel that's followed by a monosyllabic root. A word minimality constraint is what prohibits monosyllabic outputs from being optimal in the from being selected by the grammar. This word minimality constraint must be ranked higher than integrity. Integrity assigns violations in case of copying. So the optimal output here is yag yag, and that involves copying of 3 segments from the root. And thus it violates integrity 3 times. But the candidate in which integrity is not violated violates word minimality. So that's how we get this ranking here. Second, the fact that the input of the templatic vowel followed by a multisyllabic root like ngmen, the optimal output here is ngmen, in which the vowel is deleted, not ngmen, which has some kind of partial reduplication. This is because integrity, which assigns violations for copying, is ranked higher than max subseg, which assigns violations if the ghost element is deleted. Finally, we can motivate the total reduplication of the syllable into the thematic vowel slot by using agreement by correspondence constraints. For illustrative purposes here, I've collapsed these into just 2 constraints. ABCVV, which is agreement by correspondence for 2 vowels that are adjacent on the vocalic tier. Essentially, any 2 vowels that are next to one another have to correspond and agree and be identical. There's also ABC syllable syllable, which states that any 2 syllables that are next to each other that have one corresponding element like a vowel also have to agree and be identical. And so that's what these 2 constraints are what regulate total reduplication in the verb. So to sum up, the description of Ende infinitival reduplication, we've observed that phonological duplication is triggered by a thematic vowel slot, a skeletal ghost, that is realized in order to repair word minimality violations, but otherwise it's absent. And this is because copying the melody of the root into the reduplicant is more costly than just deleting the skeletal subsegment. This behavior qualifies infinitival reduplication as a hero ghost, which is a ghost element that is absent by default but swoops in to save the day, as opposed to the martyr ghost. I've put both constraint rankings for the 2 patterns of floating nasals and infinitival reduplication here, and we can immediately see that there will be a ranking paradox if the 2 patterns were to co-occur within the same input. For the martyr ghost, max subseg is ranked above integrity, while for the hero ghost, integrity is ranked above max subseg. So if we have an input, we have to decide which of these orders we're going to pick. Okay? So I'm going to show you what it looks like when these 2 patterns co-occur, and I'll solve it by proposing this finer sensitivity in the underlying form. So here's a verb mund, which means to adopt. It's monomorphemic and it's monosyllabic. So we see reduplication in its infinitival form. The floating nasals are in a stable position, and they also duplicate in the infinitive. Here's another verb, inzagai, which means to strut around. And it's also monomorphemic, but it's multisyllabic. So it doesn't reduplicate in its infinitival form. And we do see here an alternation between the floating nasal when it's root initial in the inflected form and root medial in the infinitival form. So if we first consider the verb that features both floating nasals and reduplication, mund mund, if we have integrity ranked higher than max subseg, which is what we need to have non-reduplication for the of multisyllabic forms, what we get here is that the optimal candidate, the candidate that this grammar selects, is mud mud, not mund mund. And that is because realization of the floating nasal and copying of it into the reduplicant violates integrity twice, whereas deletion of the floating nasal violates max subseg once. If integrity is ranked above max subseg, then the optimal form is going to be this one where the floating nasal just isn't realized. It's too costly. This ranking also generates the wrong results for verbs that feature floating nasals and no reduplication. So here with zangai, the observed output is one in which reduplication does not occur, so that thematic vowel has to be deleted, but the floating nasal does occur. So we want to preserve one of the ghost elements and delete the other ghost element. This grammar selects or evaluates the fifth candidate, zagai, as the most optimal form because it doesn't violate integrity. The observed candidate, zangai, violates integrity because the floating nasal copies the place feature from the following obstruent. If we were to switch the ranking of integrity and max subseg, we still wouldn't get the correct output from this grammar. The optimal form in this case will be zangzangai, in which neither the thematic vowel nor the floating nasal, neither of them are deleted, and so you get reduplication and floating nasals at the same time. So both of these cases are not what we observe in Ende. However, luckily we know that the composition of these two ghost elements at play here, that the floating nasal is a melodic ghost. It consists of a melody and lacks a skeleton, whereas the infinitival reduplication, the thematic vowel, is a skeletal ghost. It consists of a skeletal segment, subsegment, but no melody. So if we change our max constraint, this don't delete constraint, to be sensitive to this difference between melodic ghosts and skeletal ghosts, then our problem is resolved. So here are our two inputs again for mund and zangai. If we have this constraint max melody, which says don't delete a melodic ghost, if it's ranked above integrity, this preserves floating nasals whenever possible. And if max skeleton, don't delete a skeletal ghost, is ranked below integrity, then that generates infinitival reduplication only when it's needed. So our grammar now evaluates the observed outputs as the most optimal candidates. So to summarize what I've showed you, the co-occurrence of the two types of ghost patterns in Ende requires a formal distinction between subsegmental types based on their specifications of melody and structure. So I've distinguished a way that the grammar can reference these specific sub-elements in the faithfulness constraints that it uses. This binary representational distinction suggests 4 faithfulness constraints, and that predicts 4 ways in which melodic and skeletal ghosts can interact within languages. So quickly, this theory of ranked viable constraints rests on the premise that constraints in languages are universal, and it's the ranking that shows us why, or that regulates the differences in behavior between languages. So my proposal for the use of these new constraints has implications for all languages that have ghost element patterns. If I say they're sensitive in Ende, they're sensitive in all languages. So Zol's, in her dissertation, she used these 2 faithfulness constraints, max subseg and depth subseg. I'm now proposing 4 faithfulness constraints, max melody and max skeleton, depth melody, and depth skeleton. The 2 constraints that Zol proposed predict 2 types of languages, languages that have martyr ghosts and languages that have hero ghosts, but it does not predict a language that has both. With these 4 constraints, this predicts a typology of 4 different languages. We still predict a language that only has martyr ghosts, also a language that only has hero ghosts, but also languages that have melodic martyr ghosts and skeletal hero ghosts, or melodic hero ghosts and skeletal martyr ghosts. I ran this factorial typology in the, using OT-soft, and it generates 4 languages. Basically, if you change the way that the constraints are ranked within these 4 different languages, we get the 4 language types that I just explained to you. One with only martyr ghosts, one with only hero ghosts, and these 2 with conflicting behavioral types of ghosts. If we reflect back on the language data that I presented to you today, we can categorize Ende as an example of language 3 because it has melodic martyr ghosts and skeletal hero ghosts. Polish is an example of either a language 2 or language 4. We know that it contains, melodic ghosts in Polish act like heroes, but we don't know how skeletal ghosts act. So it's either language 2 or 4. Finnish is either a type of language 1 or language 4 because it features a skeletal martyr ghost, but we don't know how melodic ghosts look like in Finnish. And finally, Chaha is either language 1 or language 3 as it features a melodic martyr ghost, but we don't know how skeletal ghosts act in Chaha. The more we investigate the world's languages and pay attention to these kinds of subsegmental patterns, the more likely we'll be able to fill out the rest of this typology with more certainty. Okay. So thank you. Before we have questions, which I'm eager for, I just want to say a few special thank yous. Everything I learned about Ende was taught to me by the wonderful people of Limol, and I'm in all of their debt for this marvelous language. The corpus, the Ende language corpus, has more than 80 speakers who contributed language data, so it's a very rich corpus. I'd also like to thank my advisors for challenging me and supporting me and connecting me to the resources that I needed in order to complete my research. I'd like to especially thank Arto, in whose office most of these ideas were born and took shape. I'm also very grateful to my colleagues in my cohort and my friends who kept me sane and happy during this time. I'm especially grateful to Dinika and Grace, whose knowledge of Pahaturi River languages and culture really emboldened me to continue doing the research when it felt very challenging. And of course, this also wouldn't have been possible without all of these organizations and funders who helped me get to Papua New Guinea 5 times. So, thank you. My committee is not allowed to ask me questions, so it's up to the rest of you until later. So, okay, well, here's one thing. I was able to show you that how reduplication works. And I gave you an example using total reduplication, where you saw the root completely reduplicated in the reduplicant and in the base. But that's only one type of reduplication. There's actually more types. There's partial reduplication as well. So here's an example. So we see that monosyllabic forms reduplicate. So we get yag, 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 or, wind, 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 much, much, much. There's also partial reduplication. So here, the base contains a complex onset. And in the reduplicant, you only see a simple onset, and it's not complex. So we get dre going to dadre, rom going to rorom. We see that codas get deleted or not realized over here. And what this is it's the emergence of the unmarked. So basically in the first syllable, we see an unmarked. It doesn't have complex onsets or codas. So the question is, how can you have one grammar that produces, that reduplicates the coda in this case, but doesn't reduplicate the coda in this case? Okay. I looked and I compared the 2 different types of roots to see if there was something phonological context that could predict whether or not this coda got copied. But you get very, very close minimal pairs, and so you really can't, it doesn't seem to be phonologically predictable. So what I did is in order to have some roots have total reduplication and others have partial reduplication, this motivates the use of cophonologies. So some roots are associated with a phonology in which star coda, so don't have a coda, and star complex onset. If these are ranked above a constraint that says that the 2 syllables must be exactly identical, then what you're going to get is no coda and no complex onset in the form. If, however, the constraint that says the syllables must be identical, if that constraint is ranked above star coda and star complex onset, then you get codas and complex onsets in the reduplicant. So we have two cophonologies. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. So let me show you a map. So the Paraturi River language family is composed of 6 language varieties. The only work that's been done on these languages, Dinaka Shokin, Volker Gast, and Nick Evans a bit have worked on Idi. And then we've got we know quite a bit now on Ende. There was a linguist who was working on Tame, but there's like one notebook, and the other 3 languages we don't know much about. I can show you a really interesting difference between Idi and Ende with regards to the floating nasals. Not with the reduplication. We don't have that much data yet, but let me show you a difference between Idi and Ende. So, hold on. Let me first show you this slide. Okay, this is the phoneme inventory of Ende, and it's very similar to Idi. Ende has stops at 3 places of articulation. So we've got puba, tada, kuga. And then we have these retroflex affricates, tra, and dra. 4 nasals, mana, nya, and nga. And these 2 alveolar fricatives, sa and za. So these 10, the stops, the affricates, and the fricatives, those comprise the obstruents in the language. In Ende, a floating nasal can precede any of these 10 obstruents. When it precedes a p or a b, it's realized as an m, a m. When it precedes ta, da, tra, dra, sa, or z, it's realized as an n. And when it precedes ka and ga, it's realized as the velar nga. In Idi, you cannot get, Idi also has this floating nasal pattern, but the nasals can only precede the voiced pair, or the voiced stop, or the voiced fricative, or the voiced affricate. So if we look at this example here, the verb ko, or koko, is to build, to cut, okay? We add the applicative suffix here because we're cutting the meat for somebody, so it gets a benefactive argument, and so we get this floating nasal, this suffix that contains a floating nasal here. In Ende, when we add this suffix, the floating nasal floats leftward to precede the K in the root. But in Idi, it cannot float leftward to precede the K because floating nasals cannot precede voiceless obstruents. And so that's one difference between Idi and Ende. And that's predicted. There's many languages that have prenasalized stops or any kind of nasalization before obstruents. Typically, it's just preferred before voiceless. And so it's more interesting that Ende does allow it than the fact that Idi doesn't allow it. Yeah, CJ.
So, sorry, I don't have like simple notes.
Mm-hmm.
If the assimilation of floating nasal to the place of articulation of the following obstruent didn't occur, just appeared as an N, would we run into the same ranking paradox? Because it seems that the paradox relied a lot on the identity.
Oh, the fact that it violates integrity.
Integrity.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So in the 4 constraints that I put forward, the max constraints and the depth constraints. The problem is that with reduplication, the ghost elements are kind of copied in, and so you get this copy effect. That doesn't violate the faithfulness constraint depth. which inserts new material. So if you have something copied, you're not violating depth. And so there is still this kind of balance between max and integrity, but it's not the same like kind of straightforward black and white between max and depth. But if integrity were not, here, let me go back to that tableau. I think it was this one here, right? No, this one. So the fact that integrity was being violated because this nasal was copying the place of the following velar. If that had an epenthetic segment, which would have violated depth subseg, depth subseg is ranked above integrity, actually. So that would also have ruled out this candidate in this tableau. Yes, I didn't include the candidate. I didn't include that constraint here just for reasons of space. So, yes. Thanks.
That covers the questions from the crowd. We can ask them to leave and focus on
Okay.
the rest of the work.
Great, thank you.